Parent of killers, what your story? Most of my family is 99% certain that my cousin murdered his best friend when they were about 12. Has always been a very strange kid, prone to fits of violence. He once tried to beat my other cousin with a canoe, or for splashing him, and his dad has done time for child molestation. The two of them were alone by a river. My cousin came back and very calmly told his parents that his friend had drowned. The kid had evidence of blunt force trauma to the head, but my cousin said that he had slipped and fell. The DA and medical experts attested that it was not a wound that would have been caused merely by a slip and fall, but my cousin had a great lawyer and got off. I don't hang around that side of the family anymore, for several reasons. My great aunt was dating this guy and this guy really wanted to have sex with her. It was 1930s Italy in a remote town. Sex before marriage even to a fiancé basically made you an instant town slut. Anyway, he promised to marry her if they did, and she said yes. Well, a few days later she sees him flirting with another woman, so she goes home, grabs her father's gun, and kills him in the streets after luring him in. She only got a few years in prison and moved to Toronto a year later. Happily married with 5 kids. My son killed a family friend when he was 17. The family friend had been molesting him from 7 to 12 before finding other boys. When he was 17, he ran across this man who propositioned him for sex and my son lost it. He stabbed him in the heart with a knife and he had a heart attack and died. He did 8 years for manslaughter. His life is a wreck. He got out and wanted to go to college and get a job. College was too much for him because he was around kids his age who were more concerned about what to do on Saturday night, whereas he was worried about his parole officer showing up with 8 armed cops at our house. He completed his degree in psychology and still couldn't find a job. He couldn't even find a job at organizations that help ex-convicts because he couldn't pass a background check. He started to be unhinged and committed suicide, and he died believing that he did something wrong and to have deserved the life that he got. I was 3. My grandparents had full custody of me. My dad was a heavy drug user and alcoholic. From my understanding, my mom was to an extent, but my dad was way worse. My mom also had a lot of health issues. I'm not sure all the details of her health. She was bipolar for sure, and was on several heavy meds which she often let my dad use. She had a disability with one of her hands, but she was a very beautiful and kind woman. She was the kind of person, if she had $10 and went to the store, everyone was gonna get something when she got home. My dad killed her one night. Not sure the story of that. All I know is that he chopped her up partly. Couldn't fully dismember her, but he tried. I think he got her head partly off and an arm and made a big gash from hip to hip. He hid her in our trailer closet for 3 days. My grandpa eventually suspected that it happened and called the cops. According to neighbors, the next day he came over and drank beer and watched football and didn't even seem to be a changed person at all. I'm now 21. My dad is gonna be serving at least another 8 to 10 years in prison. He had the chance for parole after 15 years and was denied, but he could serve his whole life. Up until I was 18. I couldn't visit him. I didn't really like to, but I did it to make my family happy. I didn't know how to feel about him, and still don't tbh. I had my visitation rights taken away at 18. Since I was a victim of his crimes, I could have it overturned, but not really wanting to honestly. He only calls when he wants money, gets well over $1,000 a year from my grandma. I was lied and told it was basically an accidental death until I googled my dad's name when I was 11. I didn't speak to him for over a year, and it was right before Christmas too. My first memory is seeing my mum's grey blue closed casket. Obligatory, not my kid, but my stepdad's kid, which we will call Jay. He went on a murder spree. He wanted to kill all his family members. He successfully killed both his maternal and fraternal grandfathers. He got caught midway through the murder spree cause he left his great aunt alive and tied up. She got free after he left and called the police, and his mom, who was next on the list. Jay stole his great aunt's phone so he could pretend to be her and meet up with his mom. He ended up meeting the police instead. He had tried going to other relatives' homes, but it was in the middle of the workday and people weren't home. Otherwise he would have killed more before getting caught. He got 100 years with 0 chances of parole. The judge said the sentence was symbolic because by the time it's over, there won't be anyone left alive to remember his heinous acts. Edit. I forgot to mention how it's impacted my stepdad. He turned into an alcoholic 4 years afterwards. He did everything he could to help his son be a good person and feels like he failed. He blames himself. His son Jay is criminally insane and had shown that countless times over the course of his life. Shit, Jay tried to burn down his school. When he was in kindergarten he had already gone to jail for attempted murder up in Alaska too. Only in the last year or two really has my stepdad gotten any better. He's finally getting close again with his daughter, and the drinking has slowed some in part due to my mom. I just wish he would go to therapy and get proper help. It's unlike him to seek that kind of treatment though, cause he is a very private person and that goes against his nature. Edit 2. Meant paternal not fraternal. Oops. Not me, but my mother was in a relationship with a serial killer / pedophile. In the early to mid 80s my mom started dating this guy. She already had my older sister with another man. New boyfriend was a doting stepdad. They lived in Las Vegas. My mom ran Keno, and he was a card counter. She'd helped disguise him because he was blacklisted from most casinos for the aforementioned card counting. I came along. They continued to be the happy little super dysfunctional family until the FBI grabs my mom from work and interrogates her for hours about him. He's a rapist / pedophile / murder. My mom didn't know. She dabbled in low-level criminality, but not that stuff. Splits town with us kids. Gets back with older sister's dad. I grow up not knowing this until I'm 14 and my parents divorce and dad asks for a DNA test for me and I'm floored. Your dad isn't your dad, it's actually this evil man hoss on death row. My mom's a huge drunk and drug addict. She can't even speak to me about this without a full-fledged mental breakdown. So everything I know is spotty. She passed away 4 years ago. I'm going through her stuff and find some letters from the History Channel contacting her to participate in a documentary about him. One thing that chills me to my core. He used to call her his first victim's name during sex. She swore she never knew until after the fact, and I believe her. My uncle raped and murdered his disabled daughter and tried to frame someone else so he could collect insurance money. He got away with it for almost 20 years. One day, I get a phone call from my dad saying that we should expect the family name in the news and why. Edit. My uncle was not my child, and as such this was off topic. She was mid-teens and developmentally disabled. He tried to frame a supposed hitchhiker serial killer in the 80s. Tried to follow the same patterns. He was caught via a cold case study. Early tests had some of his DNA on her, but protection was used during the rape, and he had a passable alibi at the time. When some of the DNA was retested, they found more clues linking my uncle to the murder, and after checking with said alibi, the person who gave it confessed that they lied. The moment the police came for my uncle, he cried and thanked them for catching him. He admitted the whole thing right away and said that he couldn't handle her anymore, took out the life insurance policy, and did as he did. He is in jail for life and getting at least part of what he deserves there. He has been disowned by literally every member of the family, and 2 of his nephews have changed at least part of their name. That was from his ex-fiancée of 7 years together. He started doing meth without me knowing. 5 years and 2 kids in. Tried to get him help. When I found out, left him because he refused it. They caught him in his victim's car. He confessed 12 days into his trial. Got life plus 10. Said he wanted to know how it felt to kill someone. I'm raising our 2 kids. They don't know yet. Don't plan on telling them until they're old enough. Kills me that they will have to live with a burden like that. It's massively unfair. They certainly don't deserve it, and neither did the victim or his family. Off the meth. He was the type of person that would help the homeless, generous, outgoing, excessively intelligent and ambitious. How heavy drugs can change people into monsters. My adopted sister got into a car wreck this weekend while off her medication this weekend. She takes it so that her epilepsy is well managed. We don't know why she didn't take the meds, but she seized a grand mal and struck a mother and her 2 kids on a sidewalk or crosswalk. The 2 kids were crushed to death, and the mother is still in the ICU. My sister is also in the hospital and we don't know if she will go to prison for the accident. When I was 10 or 11, my younger brother and I were visiting our grandparents. Hanging out in the hotel, we were told that our mother had passed and our dad was going to jail. It took a while to realize what happened. I got the full story when I was 15. Dad was sleeping. Mom tried to suffocate him with a pillow. He ended up switching it around onto her, resulting in her death. According to newspaper articles, he hid her body in the woods, and according to the police, they would not have found the body unless my dad told them. He was sentenced to like 15 years in prison. He got out of prison 5 years ago or so, gets caught up in the pharmaceutical drugs, which led to harder things, and ends up getting some heroin with fentanyl laced in it, and odds. I turned out okay. I have a hard time expressing feelings in my relationship, but my fiance loves me and works with me. My great aunt killed her husband years and years ago, shot him and burned the house down after years of being abused by him. From what I know, she was convicted but didn't get jail time. Instead, she came in and worked in the prison kitchen so she could go home and take care of their kids every day. Most of her kids ended up involved in drugs and the like, so my part of the family has never interacted with them, and we don't really talk about it. My stepson killed one of his bullies in high school. He has a cleft palate, and it's a pretty bad one. All his life has been bullied for it. His mother and I have done everything we could to stop the bullying, but it never ceased. We contacted administrators, moved, switched schools, tried everything. Eventually, we decided on an online homeschooling program. Unfortunately, one of his bullies from his last school knew where we lived, had come by and taunt my stepson regularly. My wife and I were never around because the kid would come while we were working. One day, after my son tried ignoring his previous taunting, the bully figured it must have been a good idea to break in and find him. He threw a brick through our back window, which was in the guest bedroom, and proceeded to attempt to enter. Now, I partially blame myself for what happened next. My son never knew his real father, and so since I've come in, I've done everything in my power to fill in, and we grew pretty close. I ended up trusting him enough to tell him where I kept my gun. Seeing as how his mother and I worked so often, I wanted him to be able to protect himself if anything were to happen, if we were gone. So, he grabs my gun, opens the door to where the bully was, and shot him in the chest twice. He died before the ambulance reached the scene. My son was never charged for anything, as there was obvious evidence of a forced entry, and the neighbors claim that the bully repeatedly said he was gonna kill my son when he got inside. This happened almost 10 years ago, when my son was 15. Has been to so many different psychologists and therapists since something in him changed that day, like he blamed himself. For years he tried to isolate himself from the world. He became a heavy alcoholic and even attempted suicide. He blames himself for taking another human's life, even though he knows his was in danger. Seeing what happened to my boy, it's heartbreaking. I sold the gun, never got another one. To this day, he still has that look of grief and guilt in his eyes. I'm starting to believe no amount of tears will ever wash it away. Edit. Thank you all so much for the support and condolences. It's such a hard thing for me to tell this story, and so many people speaking up for my family brings tears to my eyes. I can't put into words how much this really means to me. Thank you, all of you. My brother killed his girlfriend shortly after their son was born. He still won't tell us why he did it, but he did confess, and has never once denied doing it. He's in prison until 2046 last I checked. We always knew growing up that he'd end up in legal trouble eventually, but not as early, and it did. Not a parent, but one of my cousins is a killer. Dude was a teenager when, for some unknown reason, he decided to kill his parents and siblings. I can't say his name, so let's call him John. It was early morning, around 3, and the father was out working the graveyard shift at the one gas station in town. John had sat awake all night to make sure everyone was sound asleep. He took a shotgun that he got for his birthday and crept down the hall to his little brother and sister's room to make sure they were asleep. Satisfied, he ventured into his mother's room, put the gun against her temple, and shot her. The blast woke up his siblings, and, turning around, he shot his brother as he ran out of his room. After making sure he was dead, he found his sister hiding in the closet and killed her too. To complete his mad fantasy, John dragged the bodies one by one into the living room and left them in an unceremonious pile. He then called his dad, crying on the phone saying the house had been robbed. His dad left work and drove as fast as he could to get home and see if his family was safe. As he burst through the front door, John shot him almost point blank in the chest, and he died soon after. Around 7:30 that same morning, he called the police to report the murders. According to family legend, the cops found him sitting on the couch, watching cartoons and eating a bowl of cereal, still bloody from moving the bodies. It's been a few years not, and the only reason has given for doing it was that it just felt like the right thing to do. Estranged cousin of mine killed his girlfriend's 4-year-old. Strange to think that same guy treated me like a friend he knew his whole life when we were introduced in a reunion years before. My wife's grandma had 3 sons. One died and one's been in prison for 30 years for murder. She's still leaving everything to him in the will. BC has a better person than the other surviving brother. Edit. Deceased son would be my father-in-law. One in prison, went in at 20 BC during a drug binge, got in a fight with a friend and killed him, and will tell you he regrets it every day of his life. The third post brother Aka, the man with no plan, is an emotionally and physically abusive asshole who married his brother's widow, crashed her phone more than once with tracking apps, forced her to tattoo over his brother's name, banned her of speaking about him, beat his son at least once, put hands on the mother-in-law a few times, threatened suicide a couple times to get her to stay. Not a parent, but my co-worker and her son were killed by her other son. Almost 2 years ago now. So killer son spent of his adult life in and out of jail. Small petty crimes, breaking and entering, burglary, etc. Nothing violent. Well, his last stint was for credit card fraud. My co-worker didn't want him living with her when he got out, but he ended up staying with her and her other son. Now my co-worker was an older lady, 70s, and she was super reliable. Rarely missed work, or at least called when she did. Well, she didn't show up for a shift on a Friday, and it wasn't like her. We tried calling her, no cell phone, cause she was in her 70s, and it was one more useless piece of junk, no answer. So we figured, oh no, maybe she forgot, or she was in the hospital and she couldn't call NBD. But something in my and my boss's chest didn't feel right, but trying not to let our years of forensic files get the best of us, we brushed it off. Come Monday, still no call, no show. Now I'm freaking out. So we had the police go over and do a wellness check. 4 hours later we saw on the news they had found 2 bodies in her neighborhood. I had given her rides home from work a million times as she didn't drive. Car was gone, credit cards were gone. They found her killer son in New York State. Picked him up on a parole violation. I still feel sick about it. She was such a nice lady, she didn't deserve that. Throw away. My wife saw me crying reading this thread and thought it might help to share the story. It wasn't my child, but my dog who murdered a young child. Standard, nicest dog in the world. Never saw this coming statement. She really was. Never had an incident, never bit anyone, and was great with kids. We were having a cookout. Everything seemed normal. Most of the time the kids would end up back in the house because it had AC, while the adults hung out in the backyard, cooking, drinking, etc. We had 2 dogs, both were mutts, both were shelter dogs. Not sure it matters, but it is always brought up. I'll never forget the screams and kids running from the back door to the backyard. I was on the grill and my wife ran in with a few other parents. Things start to go into a blur here. I apologize, and I kind of figured it was a random accident or kids being kids type deal. One thing I will never forget is my wife shrieking my name. I bolted inside to see my wife wrestling with the dog while it had this poor child in its grip. I rushed the dog and almost as soon as I grabbed her she let go. My wife picked up the child and was holding him. At this point other parents rushed in, including the child's parents. I'm sorry, I don't remember much here. I remember just holding down my dog while people ran around screaming, crying, and trying to help him. Still, when the paramedics arrived I had the dog pinned down to the floor. She didn't try and move once. She knew what she did. The child was rushed to the ER, but was pronounced deceased not long after being there. We were heartbroken for the family obviously. The dog was surrendered and was put down. A few nights later, the husband showed up at our house, intoxicated and wanted to talk. When I stepped outside, he punched me 3 or 4 times and I fell down to the ground. I pretty much fell on him trying to defend myself / being very stunned. He collapsed onto me, embraced me and we both started crying. We laid there on the front porch for an hour crying into each other's arms. Nephew to a killer. My grandmother raised her 6 children in the 1950s and 60s primarily solo. My grandfather suffered a traumatic head injury playing basketball with some friends crazy to think about, and his personality flipped like a switch. He became aggressive, impulsive, and abusive, so my grandma gathered my dad and his siblings and fled across the state to live with her sister and her sister's growing family in rural Missouri. My grandmother and her 7 children lived in my great-aunt's small attic space for a while as my grandmother secured a couple of jobs to keep her family afloat. She eventually saved up enough money to buy them a small 2-bedroom home in that same town. My eldest uncle bought the home from her and lives there now. It's a wonder how they managed to live in such a small space with 7 people. It is hardly big enough for just one. She lived in that home well after her children had moved out. My uncle that killed someone was the 3rd oldest, my dad the 3rd youngest, so they were pretty close in age. My uncle had 2 children with his wife. Several years later, my dad and my mom adopted my brother and I. My uncle filed for divorce from his wife when I was very young. He ultimately lost custody of their children, but because he filed for the divorce, he had assumed that custody would go to him. According to my mom, the court's decision kind of made him snap. He tracked down his ex-wife's lawyer and shot him dead. After a short time on the run, he turned himself in and was locked away in prison for life until passing away unexpectedly last year. I didn't really know my grandma before all of this happened, since I was so little, but from what I've been told, the whole ordeal really subdued her. She was always friendly to others and well networked in her small town, but some of her friends stopped being so warm after they found out what happened with my uncle, so her social circle dwindled. She became more reclusive and quiet. During holiday family gatherings, it was pretty standard for her to sit at the kitchen table just watching everyone quietly. Even through all of this, I remember her as one of the warmest, kindest, most generous people I have ever known. My dad's paternal grandfather was a serial killer. He killed over 7 people that we know about, including his wife, my dad's grandmother, and even tried killing 2 of his sons on numerous occasions. We know all this because besides being an evil mofo, he also took pride in his actions and bragged about it to whomever would list good riddance to him. My adoptive father grew up in BC, was heavily involved in gangs and drugs. I never knew much about him as a person really. He would occasionally tell me stories from the good old days, but they were very sugar-coated. He got back into drugs when I was a teenager. One day he came home all fricked up on heroin and told me in great detail about this guy he killed when he was younger and in the gang scene. I was horrified.